Chapter 28, Biogeochemical Cycling and Ecosystem Productivity. Section 28.5, Food Chains, Trophic Pyramids, and Food Webs. Okay, so we've talked about primary production and how plants produce most of the biomass found in an ecosystem. This biomass is consumed by a number of other organisms. These organisms include herbivores, omnivores, scavengers, carnivores, and detrivores. So these are all organisms that obtain their energy through respiration. They have to process already constructed organic matter. And they consume this organic matter, like glucose, to release energy for their metabolism. In all animals, digestion is an imperfect process. The portion of energy that actually is used for maintenance, growth, and reproduction is referred to as the energy that is assimilated. The undigested material, of course, leaves the organism's body through defecation. We call the energy assimilated by consumer organisms gross secondary productivity. So gross secondary productivity can be determined by directly measuring the amount of organic matter consumed minus the material defecated. The grazing food chain. So the grazing food chain is a model that describes the general flow of energy in an ecosystem. And of course, this energy begins with solar radiation from the sun. That solar radiation is fixed by plant autotrophs, and we call these plant autotrophs the primary producers. Primary producers produce sugars and other organic molecules as a byproduct. So here we can see a diagram representing the grazing food chain. So first step in this is the radiation from the sun. This energy is captured through photosynthesis by autotroph organisms or primary producers. An example of such an organism could be algae, trees, plants, grass. Primary consumers or herbivores form the second link in the grazing food chain. Any energy for herbivore metabolism is gained by feeding on primary producers. Secondary consumers, or primary carnivores, are the third link in this grazing food chain, and they obtain their energy by consuming herbivores. Their assimilation efficiencies range from 50 to 90%. So we've talked about the first four stages in this grazing food chain. We can have a fifth stage where we have a secondary level of carnivores that feed on primary carnivores. These would also be referred to as tertiary consumers. Many grazing food chains have no more than 4 or 5 trophic levels. So here in this model, we show 5 trophic levels. Now, in here, I've generalized, and we're talking about all the organisms that exist in each one of these trophic levels for an ecosystem. Okay, so the grazing food chain contains a lot of biomass, both in autotrophs and heterotrophs, or producer-type organisms and consumer-type organisms. Now, they can shed tissues, they produce waste, and of course they die. And their organic matter is processed by the detritus food chain. The detritus food chain differs from the grazing food chain in several significant ways. First of all, the organisms making up this food chain are generally smaller in size. Most of them are single-cell organisms or small multicellular organisms, Bacteria and fungi are good examples. Secondary, the functional roles of the different organisms do not fall neatly into categories like we saw in the grazing food chain. So the detritus food chain is made up of organisms that we can generally classify as detrivores. And they tend to live in environments that are rich in scattered food particles. The soil layer, seabeds, ocean bottom, lake bottoms. These detrivores, of course, are less mobile than herbivores or carnivores. We can also call the detrivores decomposers. The organisms of the detritus food chain include members of many different species of animals and plants. So organisms involved in this breakdown of organic matter include algae, bacteria, slime molds, fungi, protozoa, insects, mites, crustaceans, centipedes, mollusks, worms, sea cucumbers, and even some vertebrates like small mice, voles, living in the soil layer. So here we have a common soil decomposer, the earthworm. Decomposers tend to always be active. There's always some sort of supply of organic matter occurring within their environment. And this processing of organic matter does create a lot of energy. There's a lot of heat associated with metabolic activities. If you ever had a compost heap in your yard, you would know that you put your hand in it and it's quite warm. The end result of decomposition is the conversion of organic matter back into its inorganic nutrient form. And these nutrients then are scattered within, let's say, the soil layer. They may become attached to clay micelle particles, and they're waiting for uptake again. Of course, there are exceptions. We know that nitrogen, for example, can't hold on. Nitrogen in the form of nitrate and nitrite is freely mobile. It needs to be taken up quickly. It's not really held well by clay micelles. Well, it's not held at all by clay micelles. The rate of decomposition in the detritus food chain is controlled mainly by temperature and the amount of oxygen available for respiration. In some ecosystems, oxygen may not be readily available. In this case, we don't have the ability to do aerobic respiration, and instead organic breakdown occurs due to anaerobic means like fermentation. So some organisms that cause fermentation include bacteria and yeast. Okay, so we can model energy flow in food chains in a more quantitative way. Several different quantitative models are commonly seen in the academic literature. One of these models is called the pyramid of biomass. So what a pyramid of biomass does is it quantifies all the living biomass found in each trophic level. So here we see the pyramid of biomass for a pond where 1 centimeter is equal to 1 gram of dry biomass per unit area. So we already discussed this. Primary producers or plants are the original source of most of the fixed organic energy in ecosystems, and they tend to be the bottom level of most pyramids of biomass. The primary consumers or herbivores directly feed on the primary producers, and many plant organisms have adaptations to try to reduce herbivore loss of their biomass. They may have thorns, they may produce toxins in their tissues. This is the reason why we don't see primary consumers or herbivores completely wipe out an ecosystem of its plant biomass. Sometimes it can occur due to insect infestation, but it's rarely total. Assimilation efficiencies of most terrestrial herbivores is less than carnivore species. It ranges from about 20 to 60%. The next level in the pyramid of biomass is secondary consumers or primary carnivores. Primary carnivore organisms harvest a portion of the herbivore biomass for their nutrition. And of course, they don't eat all the herbivores. Herbivores are well adapted to not be caught and eaten. The assimilation efficiency of primary carnivores is higher than herbivores, and it ranges from about 50 to 90%. Many food chains have no more than 4 or 5 trophic levels. In the graphic example, the final level is composed of tertiary consumers who feed on secondary consumers. Another important sort of model of feeding structure within an ecosystem are food webs. A food web describes the complex patterns of energy flow in an ecosystem by modeling who consumes who. The illustration that follows describes a portion of a food web for a typical tidal marsh ecosystem located on the southern coast of British Columbia. And we can see that some organisms are fed on more than other organisms. And of course, removing these organisms can create problems in the ecosystem by the organisms that feed on them not having an alternative source of food. So there are often keystone species that play a more important role in an ecosystem than other species. An example of a keystone species is the sea otter, and it played a really important role in kelp forests, and it was hunted in the 1800s, 1900s for its fur, and it played an important role in eating sea urchins. And the sea urchins, the food of the sea urchins was the kelp forests. With the removal of the sea otter, the kelp forests were consumed to a greater extent by the urchins, and quite a bit of damage occurred to the kelp forests. The return of the sea otters brought back an important carnivore organism that once again fed on these herbivore species, the sea urchins, and this resulted in less damage to the plant community in kelp forests. Sometimes in a food web, a species may enter that is an invasive species, and it can upset the pattern of who eats who. For example, purple loosestrife is an invasive species in wetland habitats in North America, and it displaces species like typha or cattails and sedges, and that displacement provides less food for certain species that may have consumed those original species, those native species that belonged in that habitat. And this, of course, can cause numbers of these individuals that used to consume the sedges or the typha to decline because of the presence of the purple loosestrife.